A little more light would be good. There we go. All right, it is 7:45 p.m. Central Time. Thank you all for joining us again this evening. I'm going to introduce our next speaker, our final speaker for tonight. And I know some folks will have to go, so I'll just mention briefly that we do begin tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock promptly. The doors will open at 8 o'clock, and there will be coffee and some light snacks available as there are right now. So 9 o'clock will be our first presentation tomorrow morning. Okay, before I introduce our next speaker, I would like to give a special thank you to one of our event sponsors, Brooks Bible College, and I'd like to invite the college president, Dr. Robert Thurman, to say a few words about the college.
Well, thank you. Usually people clap when I'm done because they're happy that I've finally stopped speaking. But I want to welcome you tonight. Thank you so much for putting on this conference. We love this ministry. At Brooks, we teach our students that Scripture is authoritative and clear from Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, all the way to the end of Revelation. And we are so glad that there are ministries like this one who supplement what we can do in teaching people about God's creation. We do have a micro degree, a micro credential now in creation science. And John at the back table would be happy to tell you about that. We have an excellent faculty, and I think you would enjoy either auditing that or taking that for credit. But we've been here in St. Louis since 1909. And we are an accredited institution. We offer associate's, bachelor's degrees. We're working on more. And our commitment is just to train up people who are well equipped to serve Christ and to serve the church and to make an impact on the world. And so we're grateful for you. Thank you for being here. Please come and find out more about us. We'd love to meet you.
Thank you, President Thurman. All right. So it's now my privilege to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Randy Guliuzza. Dr. Guliuzza has a Bachelor's of Science in Engineering from the South Dakota School of Mines and Technology, a Bachelor of Arts from Moody Bible Institute, an MD from the University of Minnesota, and a Master's of Public Health from Harvard University. He joined the Institute for Creation Research in 2008 and was appointed the president of ICR in 2020. And he's the author of several books and DVDs, many of which you can find at the ICR resource table there in the back. So please join me now in welcoming Dr. Guliuzza.
That's my water. Yeah, thank you. Wow, what a blessing it is to be here. Zachary, you've done an outstanding job of organizing this conference, so thank you very much. And everyone else in the back, the pastor was here. I wanted to thank him. Dr. Brown couldn't have asked for a stronger, more powerful, better way to kick off this conference than your talk on added beauty. What a blessing that was. Thank you. Thank you for bringing that to us tonight. It was a pleasure to listen to. Dr. Thurman, what a blessing. You and Dr. Brown said everything up here perfectly for me tonight. You said something here that was so good. You said you teach that Scripture is clear. Clear. Did you guys catch it? He said we teach it is clear. I can't foot stomp that enough. That is the issue. That is the difference between the Institute for Creation Research and so many other ministries that are out there claiming to be teaching truth. For instance, I was taught that told just a couple of days ago that Hugh Ross from Reasons to Believe was speaking in the local area. So what's the big difference between ICR and Reasons to Believe? Reasons to Believe says they believe in the inerrancy of the Bible. ICR says we believe in inerrancy. They say we believe in inspiration. ICR says we believe in inspiration. But what we hold to that they don't is that the Bible is clear. Clear means that the average person in the pew can read it and understand it for yourself without having to have a holy person come and tell you what the Bible says, or without having to have a science guy come and tell you what it says. Hughes says you cannot understand Genesis 1 and 2 until a scientist interprets it for you. And what that is doing, that is taking away biblical authority and placing us way back to prior to the Reformation, when the church was telling people you can't understand the Bible for yourself, you have to have a priest come and tell you what it says. The Reformers said that is wrong. Bible says it is clear. God says what he means what he says, and you do not need to insert something between you and the Bible, which then becomes your authority. The Bible is clear. And that is the big difference. Biblical clarity. The fancy name is perspicuity, but clarity is right up there with inspiration and inerrancy. Make no mistake, it is just as important, because it means nothing to have a book that is inspired if you can't understand it. So you have to have it understandable and inspired, and that is the big difference between ICR and several of these others. So tonight, even as Dr. Brown was already mentioning, we're here to help you think differently and try to see things differently. So we're going to talk about major evolutionary blunders, and we're going to talk about why they happen. That's important. That'll change your thinking. And two, what harm they cause. Now, these blunders are not harmless. They actually have various harms. But in the back of the room where my good wife, June, is sitting in the nice blue shirt, we have a sign-up sheet for everybody back there, because for 50 plus years, our ministry has given away a magazine, and there's a bunch of free copies on the table called Acts and Facts, and that magazine literally changed my life when I was a student at Moody Bible Institute. When I went to Moody, believe it or not, because nobody had ever taught me anything different, I still held to evolutionary beliefs. I still argued with fellow Moody students, trying to convince them about theistic evolution. And one day in the library at Moody Bible Institute, our magazine, Acts and Facts, was there. And I never knew I'd become president of that ministry. I took it back to one of those cubicles, read it. 2 articles by Dr. Dwayne Gish, and they literally, bang, changed my life. I was born again, where I saw the truth of creation for the first time, and it was that magazine, Acts and Facts. And I encourage you, sign up for that. We will mail it to you free. We have donors who give us money so that we can mail this out for free. It will keep you current on scientific things. You can use it, parents, to educate your kids, grandparents for your grandkids. It's absolutely free. Also, I don't even know exactly what all of these things stand for myself, but younger people do, and you can follow us on those things. I'm aware of what YouTube is, but you can follow us on those things. So subscribe to that, sign up for Acts and Facts, follow us on these various types of social media. And I see some of you are taking notes, but if you're like me and you'd rather just sit back and, as Dr. Brown said, enjoy the pictures, we have this book in the back, 20 Evolutionary Blunders. Everything I'm going to talk about is in that book, and it's documented and has the references there, and it's not very expensive. We're not going to get anywhere close to 20 tonight. I used to do this talk and talk about 8, and I was going so fast and it was running so long that we couldn't ever get to them. So we're going to talk about 4 tonight, only 4 of these blunders, and it's basically going to be a conversation. It's going to be a friendly conversation with some of these people, and all of you probably recognize at least somebody up there, some of you even more. They're famous evolutionists, and they have all said things. But we want to find out today not just what they say, but what they see, what they actually see, and because of what they see, why they say. So when we're talking about seeing, what in the world is it that you see? So right now, you see me, and you are seeing something like that. Well, what we have up there on the little screen is just a little data It's a little stream of data, those little dots there. It's actually from a cat, not from a human being, and it's only from 10 neurons for a little bit of time. And so your brain is taking in all of this data, all of these kinds of things. So how in the world do you actually see something along those lines? Well, seeing is almost like matching data, but nobody knows exactly where the data is stored in your brain. All we know is there's various areas of those kinds of things. So when you're taking in data, your brain rapidly searches for a matching pattern, and when it can come up with something that is matching it, you actually get the perception of seeing. So right now, you kind of have the feeling that you're looking at me and you're seeing me in your eyes, but you are not. You're not seeing me in your eyes. You're actually seeing me in your brain, and it's not even up at the front, it's at the back where your neck attaches to your skull. That's where you are actually perceiving me right now, and it's due to a lot of functions in your brain where it's matching everything together. And so when it matches things, they can be true patterns. A true pattern. So when you look at me, somewhere you're matching in your brain a pattern of a man moving his arms. That's stored in your brain somewhere. A pattern of a really young, virile man moving his arms. Hey, laugh at real jokes. That was like, that was there. So, that's a true pattern in your brain. But your brain can also match phony patterns and faulty patterns and even phantom patterns in your brain. We're going to cover some of those tonight. So let me give you a really quick test. Tell me, how fast does your brain match this pattern? Boom. I mean, in a fraction of a second, it took in all of that data and it pulled it together. It's just a marvel of computing power that can do something like that. Okay, here's a test, particularly for the kiddos here. Can you see in this picture the spooky house? Can you see the spooky house there on that? And how about this? Can you see the primitive features on some of these fish? Which ones are the primitive features on the fish? And then when you look at these rock layers, can you see the ancient rock layers? Well, the fact of the matter is, on the right-hand side of the screen, those layers are not ancient at all. Those were taken from Mount St. Helens in 1980. And they were put down in only 2.5 days. 2.5 days. And they look an awful lot like the rock layer that we see on the left, which was taken from the Badlands of South Dakota, which we're told are tens of millions of years old. And you know what? None of the houses are really spooky at all. We just see old and beat up houses, and then we think, oh, that's a spooky, spooky house. And none of those fish had primitive features because they're all alive right now. So we can actually put things into our brain that are stored there somehow, some way, that are like phantom and phony and false patterns. And that's because we have something that can be used called imagination. Imagination. Now, imagination is a wonderful thing. It's an incredibly good thing. I mean, you imagine things, you envision things that really aren't there. Engineers use it all the time on there. But imagination can also lead you astray. And this is the link to evolutionary thinking. And this is the reason. So if you're taking notes right now, the number one reason why evolutionists commit blunders is because they run what they're seeing through their imagination. The number one reason why evolutionists commit these blunders is because they run what they are seeing through their imagination. And when you think about it, evolutionists can't escape it. Imagination is a fundamental part of their theory. Even Stephen Jay Gould, probably the leading evolutionary theorist ever, said that a fundamental tenet, a fundamental pillar, he said, of evolutionary thinking is extrapolation. Now, what he meant by his extrapolation is you look at things in the present and you try to figure out how they were tens to maybe hundreds of millions of years ago. But in order to try to figure out what happened hundreds of millions of years ago, you have to extrapolate back in time. And another name for extrapolating back 100 million years is nothing but pure, raw, unadulterated, what? Imagination. And the further back in time you go, the more you have to invoke. You have to invoke. So, evolutionary blunder number one, right here, the imaginary Piltdown man. Now, creationists, we've kind of kicked Piltdown man around, and we kind of make fun of evolutionists. Oh, you made this terrible blunder, you did all this and everything else. But we want to learn why. Why did they make this blunder? And will they make this blunder again? That's what's really important here, is why in the world did they make this blunder? So I dug back, and one thing about being at Harvard is they have just great libraries. So I was able to go to the library at Harvard and find this paper. It was in the library from 1913 there, and it was the first report on Piltdown man from the leading scientific journal of the day, which was Science at that time. And so you could actually go there and look at it, and this is what the paper said, that this was a discovery of the greatest importance, the nearest approach we have yet reached to a missing link. Probably few will deny that Eanthropus, that is early man, Dawsoni, named after the guy who discovered it, Dawson, is almost, if not quite as much human as simian and the higher primate. And so they're looking at this paper all along. And then the significance was, they said this, it was a discovery of the greatest importance, the nearest approach we have yet to this missing link. And what had they discovered on this missing link? Well, these were the bones. These were the bones, and everybody now knows that these were fake. Somebody faked them, probably Dawson himself had stained them, that they looked like they were old, and it had the brain case the top of a brain case of a real human being. And it had the jaw of an ape creature. Some say it's an orangutan. But they had been stained on all of those things, and they fooled a lot of people. And that's because evolution has to extrapolate or has to imagine things. Now tell me, look at those bones. Do you see a little bit of imagination between that and the very first scientific picture, drawing of this creature? Look, there it is. Boom. We'll go back. There's the bones. There's the drawing. And you know what? I was one of those people who, when I was a kid, I was swayed by these kind of drawings. I believed them. I looked at them. Oh, that's what cavemen looked like. And I was convinced by that, and your kids could be too. And maybe if you think back and you're honest, you might have been swayed by these same kind of drawings, which were in National Geographic and other things as well. Well, obviously, this was proved to be a missing link, and in 1954, Science published a retraction of this. But remember, I showed you it was discovered in 1913, and the retraction wasn't until 1954. So that's 4 decades later. 4 decades later. And not only 4 decades later, 4 decades and a lot of accolades later. Here's a picture in 1915 of the leading scientists. If you were back then, you would judge by their faces, you would know exactly who they are, who were studying this. And as a picture of them studying these bones right there. And it says this was a caption: the skull eventually brought knighthood to its 3 leading expositors. These learned gentlemen were honored after having spent many years and many pages discoursing on the very human features they discerned in Piltdown man's ape-like jaw, and the very ape-like features they found in its human cranium. In fact, if we would have had the time, we could have gone back to the 1913 paper, and they're discussing it. They're looking at a real human skull, but they're describing in the science paper the ape-like features that they see. Why are they seeing ape-like features in a human skull? It's because they're running what they see through their imagination, and therefore they see it. And vice versa, it says, the human features in that human cranium. The Piltdown skull illustrates the ever-present danger for scientists of seeing exactly what they expect to see. That's because what you see in your brain, and this is why, we can't always just kick them around, because when they're seeing stuff, they're not seeing the same thing that we're seeing because they're running it through an imaginary feature. Now, would that ever happen again today? Of course it would happen again. In 2009, ICR's phone started ringing off the hook with papers that were published about this thing called IDA. IDA. It was another ape-like feature. In fact, this is what the paper showed. This was from The Guardian. And that's the fossil that was described as something that was in our ape-like ancestry. Now, when we saw that fossil, when people were calling us, we said, boy, that fossil looks an awful lot like a lemur to us. It looks like a lemur. But not in the reports that were taking over everybody's thinking at the time. It says this, fossil Ida. Fossil Ida was an extraordinary find, and it is the missing link in human evolution, giving unprecedented insight into our ancestry. It went on to say this, the more, the more you what? The more you look at Ida. David Attenborough said, he's the one that narrates all of those nice nature shows that we love to listen to. So David Attenborough says, the more you look at Ida, the more you can see, as it were, the primate in embryo. So how is David Attenborough seeing the primate in embryo, but when people are asking us at ICR, we said, it looks like a lemur. But it's because David Attenborough, the more he looks at it, the more he invokes what? Imagination, and he is seeing. In his mind, he is actually seeing this primate in embryo. And the man who discovered this fossil, he said this. He said, this one will be pictured in the textbooks for the next 100 years. 100 years. Now, when I brought Ida up here on the screen, none of you said, oh, yeah, I remember Ida. You're looking at me like, what are you talking about? That's because Ida didn't last 100 years. Ida didn't even last 100 days. Because less than several months later, it was this controversial item found is no missing link. It wasn't a missing link at all. In fact, scientists, after looking at it, said Ida wasn't even a close relative on that. And they went on to say this, that Ida is as far removed from the monkey-ape-human ancestry as any primate could be. In fact, several papers went on to describe Ida, and guess what they said it was? This was a fossil of a lemur. It was a fossil of a lemur. So you have to, in a way, kind of feel sorry for people like this who believe so strongly in a worldview. They even believe, even after Piltdown Man's been proven false, Ida's been proven false, and so many others on this, they're still believing that there's this ape-like human ancestry. It's still ingrained in their minds. But Jane Manshine from Arizona State University, still an evolutionist herself, she does point this out. You only have to recall the Piltdown adventure, or maybe we should call it a misadventure, to see how easily susceptible researchers can be manipulated into believing that they have actually found just what they had been looking for. And so the answer to the question is, what do they see? Well, in their mind, what these evolutionists see is what they expect to see because it's being run through their imagination. And why do they say it? Well, I can honestly say probably most of them do not believe. Not David Attenborough. None of them are actually believing that they're lying to you. When they tell you and when they tell your children that these are legitimate fossils and finds, they're not believing that they're lying to you because they actually see these things. And that's why they commit these blunders. So what can we take home from this Piltdown Man fiasco right there? One, Piltdown Man was not an anomaly. Piltdown Man was probably the very first fiasco, and it kind of set the stage. It set the stage for these additional blunders which have been happening due to imagination. But on the negative side, You would think if you were a group and you've made an embarrassing blunder, you would try to learn from that so that you don't repeat these blunders again. So unfortunately, it's not an anomaly, and it becomes the prototype of all of these imagination-based blunders. Well, that was way back, 1913. Who's going to make that blunder again? Well, they're going to make the blunder again with this fossil, Archaeoraptor. And this is a picture from National Geographic magazine. This is another one. And National Geographic magazine headlined this fossil, 2000, depending 2001, when you're looking at it there. And you can see feathers for T-Rex. Feathers for T-Rex. Feathers for T-Rex, and that was the title of the article in National Geographic. New bird-like fossils are missing links in dinosaur evolution. So they believe that birds evolved from dinosaurs, and they really, really believe that. And so when they see things, their imagination kicks in. It kicks in too strongly, and so that they begin to see things which really aren't there. And so there's a picture of Archaeoraptor there. That's the fossil up on the screen. That's the man who they discovered this fossil, and it was actually purchased at a show in Tucson, Arizona. I've been to that show. They've got tens of thousands of fossils there. But the problem with the show is not only does it have legitimate fossils there, it has fake fossils there. But at the time that the person purchased this fossil right there, and at the time that National Geographic was researching this fossil, it said this, and National Geographic declared, it is a true missing link in the complete chain that connects dinosaurs to birds. It seems to capture the paleontological moment when dinosaurs were becoming birds on that. And then they went on to say quite definitively and conclusively this, we can now say that birds are theropods, that's a type of dinosaur, just as confidently as we can say humans are mammals. That's pretty confident. Everything from lunch boxes to museum exhibits will change to reflect this revelation. Unfortunately, they were seeing something which really wasn't there, because somebody who was very, very clever, a fossil hunter in China, had found the fossil of a bird and had found the fossil of a lizard and had very carefully and in a very crafty way, I mean, this would take some incredible skill to do this. You talk about added beauty, man, this is added talent. This is incredible added talent. He glued those together in such a way that it fooled all these researchers. It fooled the people who brought it to the United States. It fooled the person who purchased it. It obviously fooled all of these people at National Geographic. That was some incredible added talent to make this in forgery that was so well. But all you had to do was actually research it, and you would have found that this was a forgery, which is eventually what happened, and it was discovered. And then just a few years later, this is the quote about that. Red-faced and downtrodden. You can kind of even picture it in your mind. Here are these paleontologists, all red-faced from embarrassment and downtrodden because they've been snookered. Paleontologists are growing convinced that they have been snookered by a bit of fossil fakery from China. You know, I haven't even used that word snookered in a long time. My dad used to use it when I was a kid. Don't get snookered and things like that. Well, these guys were totally and completely snookered by this. The feathered dinosaur specimen that they recently unveiled, to much fanfare, apparently combines the tail of a dinosaur with the body of a bird. They say it's the craziest thing I've ever been involved with in my entire career. Well, why? Why did it happen? What can we learn from this? Well, we know one thing, Archaeoraptor doesn't exist. It's not a real fossil, not a real bird, not at all. The fossil was a forgery, and there's no undisputed definitive evidence at all that birds evolved from dinosaurs. None. That's just another manifestation of the same exuberant imagination that took this similar researchers back in 1913 down the same fossil fake road that was happening again. So that's imagination, and that's how it led things astray. Well, now in the book, the 20 Evolutionary Blunders, I go through multiple things, but here's one that many people still believe, and it was one that I was taught, and it was one that I was believed, that your appendix is a vestigial organ, that it's a remnant from your evolutionary past, that it used to have a function, but now due to evolution, it has completely lost its function and everything. So it's completely misleading. But I believed it. I believed it so much that I used to repeat this to other people, just like I used to repeat that the bone that all of you are sitting on, your tailbone, was a piece of fossil fakery, was a piece of, excuse me, not fossil fakery, was a vestigial organ, something useless when we had a tail from our ape-like ancestors and things like this. And the president of the American Academy for the Advancement of Scientists, he's now passed away, but his name was Francis Ayala. He wrote in this book, Darwin's Gift, on that, he said this about the appendix. While he's president of the American Academy of Advancement of Science. A familiar rudimentary organ in humans is the vermiform, that means like a worm-like, the worm-like appendix. It is a functionless vestige of a fully developed organ present in other mammals. Vestiges are instances of imperfections, like the imperfections seen in anatomical structures. They argue against creation by design, but are fully understandable as a result of evolution by natural selection. So he is using this in two ways. First, he's using it as an argument against design. And his thinking goes like this: why in the world would an all-powerful, omniscient, creative, and artistic God, why would he put a useless, functionless thing inside of human beings? I mean, that makes no sense. What kind of God would do such a thing as this? And then number two, he says, not only is it an argument against design, but it is an argument for evolution, because it's obviously lost its function. We can see it has a function in other creatures, but now it has lost its function over time. And the only reason why that would happen is if evolution was happening, and therefore this is strong evidence. This is strong evidence for evolution. Of course, he's making this assumption based on one thing, that this appendix really has no function whatsoever. But in reality, anytime someone makes these arguments about vestigial organs, all that really is just an argument from ignorance. I don't know what the function is. I don't understand what the function is, and anybody making such an argument puts themselves out on a limb, because all that has to happen is more research has to take place until someone discovers the function for it. You know, the irony is this: Francis Ayala is president of the American Academy of Sciences. He's writing this book in the mid-2000s, and I was in medical school in the early 1990s, and when I was a student in med school in the 1990s, I already knew. It was already being taught in med school. I had a book on histology which defined and delineated functions for the appendix that you had. It was understood 15 years before Francis Ayala was ever publishing his book. And when I was in med school, this was kind of news to me, because I was an engineer. Praise the Lord for engineers. I like a lot of form too, following function. But I was reading this and it said, oh, it has tissue. It has tissue that's immunological in function. And that's exactly what it does. And it's positioned in a really good spot in your body. Because as food is going through your small intestine, it hits a junction right there between the small intestine and the large intestine. And there's an appendix sitting right there. And what that appendix does is it samples what's going by, what's transiting from the small intestine to the large intestine. And signals are sent in, and your body, believe it or not, adjusts its response to the bacteria that are in your gut so that it regulates the types and the amounts of bacteria that you need to have. It's not even doing it to defend you. It's not doing it to keep you safe. It's doing it because your diet changes, and you may go from here to another place, and your body will adjust its repertoire of the bacteria within 24 hours. How does it happen? Well, you have to have a sensor. You have to have something that can sense and sample that, and your appendix does it. You can live without it, but it certainly has a function. And then on top of that, it also serves as a little reservoir, a reservoir for bacteria that you want to have in your gut at all the times. And it constantly seeds your large intestine with those bacteria that then begin to multiply and divide, and they keep the flora, what's called your flora, in your gut at the right amount. And if you were to actually take chemotherapy, or if you were to take strong antibiotics, you can destroy the bacteria in your gut, the good ones, the ones that you want. And that appendix, poop, 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 it releases it into the gut and reestablishes that. And you want those. I mean, if not, you may go to the doctor and you might have to take a pill to reestablish the flora inside your gut. And what the pill is a condensate of fecal material that a donor has given to you. Now, which would you rather do? Have an appendix or take a donor fecal pill on that? I know what I'd prefer any day of the week on these things. So that's another reason why you have your appendix. And so this is basically what you see when you used to see in papers. It pointed out that you had all of these things had no appendix, no function on it. And so I just put up here papers that you can pull down from the internet on all of those things. And if you read them really closely, it says the body's appendix has long been thought of as nothing more than a worthless evolutionary artifact, good for nothing except a potentially lethal case of inflammation. And in fact, another evolutionist at the University of Chicago, Jerry Coyne, says that as well. This appendix is worthless. Why would God put it in you when it's been the cause of the death of so many people? But then you start turning into one paper after another paper after another paper, which they began to point out, this appendix does have a function. And then basically say this: although it's widely viewed as a vestigial organ with little known function, recent research, it was the same research I mentioned had actually happened decades earlier, suggests that the appendix may serve an important purpose. And if we had time, I could go on with paper after paper after paper, and some of them even say that we need this appendix because a world without an appendix in people would be a world with more deaths. So Darwin was totally wrong. But he was wrong because he viewed something which he didn't know what the function was, ran what he was seeing through his evolutionary imagination. Francis Ayala did the same thing. Jerry Coyne did the same thing. And one evolution after another does the exact same thing. And they come up with a blunder, a major blunder on these things. And is it harmful? Well, I guess you could say it was, because many times when surgeons would go in and they would be operating inside your abdomen for something completely unrelated to an appendix, they would just prophylactically remove a perfectly healthy appendix while they were in there, just so you wouldn't get a case of appendicitis. And so maybe that's a harm, particularly if you didn't want that thing to be gone. But the biggest harm, and this is one I'll just camp on the most, is something that we really need to discuss. And this was the eugenics disaster. The eugenics disaster. Now, the word disaster is not mine. This is a word from an evolutionist who called it, really, the eugenics disaster. And really, some of you may not even know what I'm talking about, because for a long time, I had never even heard of eugenics. All the time I was growing up and going to school in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and all that college, nobody was talking to me about eugenics. And nobody was even telling me about the practice of it, something that was just 100 years ago. 100 years ago in the United States right now was a major practice. And you're going to see as I go through some of these slides exactly what it is. So what am I talking about when I say the eugenics disaster? What in the world is eugenics anyway? Well, eugenics was a belief. And it was a very strongly held belief in many of the so-called developed countries, Great Britain, the United States, Western Europe, Germany, and places like that. And it was the view that you could control human evolution, just like you would control breeding. So that's what it says up on the screen. Eugenics was the quest to improve humanity's genetic composition. Eugenics selectively bred superior people and eliminated genetic defects by sterilizing, aborting, or euthanizing the inferiors. Now, if you were a eugenicist at the time and you wanted to advance the human race and you wanted to advance the superior people, who were those superior people? Well, you wanted to know who the superior people were, you would look in the mirror. Because that was the person, you know, you're not going to abort the person in the mirror. You're not going to euthanize the person in the mirror. You're going to find someone who doesn't look like you, somebody from a different culture. And those are the people that you wanted to eliminate, that you thought were the inferior ones. And it goes right back to evolutionary teaching. In fact, I'm going to be far more specific. It goes back to a specific, and if you're taking notes, this is what you need to say. Eugenics and the practice of eugenics did not go back to evolution. I mean, does that even make any sense? The practice of eugenics goes back to Darwin's conception of natural selection. That's the link. That is the link. And so anytime we're talking very, very broadly about evolution, wrong. You're way, way off the mark. You need to hone it right down to Darwin's conception of natural selection. And these are the words from Darwin himself. So we're going to read through several of these quotes. But I think you'll see as we go through them this link. How in the world do you get to Darwinian selectionism to eugenics? And so Darwin says this: natural selection as affecting civilized nations. I have heretofore only considered the advancement of man from a semi-human condition to that of the modern savage. But some remarks on the action of natural selection on civilized nations may be worth adding. The subject has been ably discussed by Mr. W.R. Gregg and previously by Mr. Wallace and Mr. Galton. And Francis Galton was Charles Darwin's cousin. And he goes on to say what he's talking about. With the savages, the weak in body or mind are soon eliminated, and those that survive commonly exhibit a vigorous state of health. We civilized men, on the other hand, do our utmost to check the process of elimination. We build asylums for the imbecile, the maimed, and the sick. We institute poor laws, and our medical men exert their utmost skill to save the life of everyone up to the last moment. Thus, he goes on to conclude, the weak members of civilized societies propagate their kind. No one who has attended to the breeding of domestic animals will doubt that this must be highly injurious to the race of man, by accepting in the case of man himself hardly anyone who is so ignorant as to allow the worst of his animals to breed. And that is the link. And so basically, to sum up what Darwin is saying is this. He said, when you go out to uncivilized nations, people that are born or develop diseases, or they're born with some incapacity or something like this, they soon die. They're soon eliminated by natural selection, and therefore they never go on to reproduce, they never go on to propagate their kind. But we, he's going to say, in civilized nations, we have stopped the action of natural selection. We have medical people who intervene to preserve these lives. We set up institutions to keep them alive. And as long as they're alive, they go on to reproduce more of their inferior kind, and therefore this reproduction of these inferior kinds is tearing down the entire human race. And he says when you compare what we're doing to people who are breeding cattle, the people who are breeding cattle are a lot smarter because they only let their best breed, but we let anybody breed. Now you should be getting this feeling right now that this should start to make you feel a little sick. A little sick. Over in Great Britain, now you notice I'm going to be saying Great Britain and the United States. I'm not saying Nazi Germany. I'm not saying Nazi Germany because it wasn't established at this time as strongly in Nazi Germany as it was in Great Britain and in the United States. So over in Great Britain, which was the think tank for eugenics at the time, there was another man. He was very famous. His name was Karl Pearson. Karl Pearson was a brilliant mathematician. And while I was at Harvard taking biostatistics class, we were actually still using mathematical formulas and statistics that Karl Pearson had developed. There's even a test called Pearson's test. But on the other hand, Pearson was also a militant eugenicist. And so he will write at the same time, and this will become very influential. So that's a picture of Karl Pearson up there on the screen. And he goes on to say this, and he's writing, by way of context, he's writing to medical doctors. So he's writing to people like myself. And this is what he's going to tell the medical doctors. Let me, even at the risk of talking about the familiar, sketch for you the broad outline of Darwin's theory of evolutionary progress. The individual, better fitted to its environment, lived longer than its fellows, had more offspring, and these inheriting better fitness, by the way, from an evolutionary standpoint, that's something nobody's been able to define what really is fitness, raised the type of the race. So he's saying, as we look back at human evolution, the best were the ones that survived, and the best reproduced, and because the best are reproducing, humanity is on this ever upward trajectory. He goes on to say this, nevertheless, medical science has to face the fact that the upward progress of man in the past has been largely controlled by stringent natural selection, stringent Darwinian selection. Stringent means this: you're sick, you die. You get a disease, you die. You're born with a defect, you die. That's stringent Darwinian selection. He goes on to speculate, what will happen if by increased medical skill, remember he's talking to doctors here, by increased medical skill and by increased state support and private charity, we enable the weaklings to survive and to propagate their kind. I say that the general death rate is selective. What's selective? The death rate. In many ways, medical science has led to the survival of the unfit. He goes on to say, that is, I think, the ever-present fear which the scientific mind recognizes. Civilized man has largely destroyed crude natural selection. In my own mind, and in a growing number of other minds, civilization will end unless civilization can find a method of doing for itself what natural selection did for man during his ascent, ensuring that he shall breed only from the best. The study of how this is possible forms the subject matter of what we term the science of genetics. We have to replace the ruthless action of evolution? No. We have to replace the ruthless action of natural selection by the reasoned conduct of civilized man. Now just take in what he just said. He said that before this, dead people that were sick died. And that was stringent Darwinian selection. But now he's talking to you doctors. He says, you doctors, you're putting an end to natural selection because you are saving too many people. And you are allowing them to go on. And you are threatening civilization. And then the irony of all ironies, he says, we need to repeat this action of stringent natural selection, which will be the evidence that we're now a civilized nation. I mean, can you get your thinking any more mixed up than that? That is really messed up thinking. Now, where was this thinking happening? I mentioned in Great Britain. But by the 1920s, 1930s, in the United States of America, over 30 states had passed mandatory sterilization laws. There's none on the books now. But 100 years ago, dozens of states in this country had mandatory sterilization laws where if somebody from the state deemed you unfit, you could be forcibly sterilized. And this case went to the Supreme Court. Here's a picture of a gal. The gal is on the left. Her name is Carrie Buck. Carrie Buck was determined by someone to be an imbecile. An imbecile. She was mentally deficient, they determined that she was. And they said not only was Carrie Buck mentally deficient, but her mother was too. And that's Carrie's mother on the left. They said, you're mentally deficient, your mother was mentally deficient. They wanted on to say your grandmother was mentally deficient. And so this deficiency has been passed on from one person to another. And a man named Bell said she should be sterilized. Well, Carrie Buck didn't want to get sterilized. And so she took this case and it went all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States. And so this is a quote from the decision by the United States Supreme Court that said this. Carrie Buck, tell me how definitive this sounds. Carrie Buck is the probable potential. She's the probable potential parent of an adequate offspring, likewise afflicted, that she may be sexually sterilized without detriment to her general health, and that her welfare and that of society will be promoted by her sterilization, and thereupon make the order. Boom. She lost her case, and she was forcibly sterilized. In the United States. And that case decided it so that others could be forcibly sterilized. And you saw what the link was. It's going back to this whole idea of natural selection, and that we're eliminating natural selection and we're letting the unfit go on to propagate their kind. The Chief Justice of the United States of the Supreme Court, Oliver Wendell Holmes, he wrote the opinion for the majority. And this is what he said, quote, "It is better for all the world if society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. The principle that sustains compulsory vaccination is broad enough to cover the cutting of the fallopian tubes. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough." Wow. And that was it. It's better for all of society. Well, you know what? Carrie Buck didn't turn out to be mentally deficient in any way. Carrie Buck had normal intelligence. You know what Carrie Buck's problem was? Carrie Buck was poor. She was poor. And because she was poor and she lived in a poor area, her education was what? That was what was deficient. And so Carrie Buck went on to get married, but Carrie Buck obviously never had any children on that. So here you have the state decreeing this. In fact, Oliver Wendell Holmes said, if you can draft men to go off and fight and die for the country, for the good of the country, you can certainly cut fallopian tubes for the good of the country. And that was the thinking. And that thinking had taken over. In fact, these are pictures from various forums where eugenics was happening and was taking place, and it was the thinking. There you see state fairs up on the left, where you could actually go and go to eugenics classes and things at the state fair and learn about it. In fact, not only could you go there, in the lower right-hand side of the screen is where parents, they're not taking their flowers and they're not taking their tomatoes to be judged as to the best, they're taking their kids. And the kids are going to get a blue ribbon as being judged, the fittest of the best on that. And then look up at the right-hand type of the screen. Can you imagine happening today where you have boys in public schools where they have to strip down to their waist so the teacher can examine them to see who is the fittest? And can you imagine getting a eugenics card on the lower left-hand side of the screen? Wives, you could go in and you could get your husband examined by a doctor, and the doctor gives him the thumbs up. That's even better than art. And they give you a card saying, here it is, your husband's been examined, and more likely to pass on good genes to you on all of these kinds of things. This is just quite remarkable that these things are happening. And it's all being driven by this man's thinking of Charles Darwin there. And you wonder, how in the world did it even take over all of the thinking these days? Well, it's because at the time, the best of the best scientists all believed in eugenics. They held the highest positions at universities. They spoke at all of the world-renowned conferences. And when states held hearings on eugenics, they were the ones who were invited. And the smartest of the smart said, eugenics is the way to go. And any of those other scientists that aren't saying it, well, they're not really real scientists. Because the real scientists know that eugenics is scientifically established fact. That sounds like a mechanism you could use to get your way in almost anything. And then not only that, they had publications. They had peer-reviewed publications. So here's a picture of it there called Eugenics Quarterly. I don't know if you can see it. Yep, over there on the screen. Eugenics Quarterly. And then in 1969, the title was suddenly changed to this on that. Eugenics Quarterly was changed to Social Biology. Social Biology. And that this forced sterilization continued. It didn't end in the 1930s, 40s. It didn't end after the fall of Nazi Germany in the 40s. It continued on in the United States in the 50s, continued in the 60s. And what you're looking there are the two of the three Relf sisters. And they were the last people in the United States who were forcibly sterilized in Alabama in 1973. 1973 on that. And these two girls were taken in and forcibly sterilized at the age of 12 and 14. Just think about the life-altering action. Their older sister, she wasn't forcibly sterilized. She had an IUD forcibly inserted into her. And this continued on until 1973. 1973. And then the eugenics didn't really go away. It just morphed. It just morphed into the abortion industry in this country, where other people who are considered to be unfit or unwelcome are now aborted. And people can go in for genetics counseling, and you can get counseled if you're going to have a defective child to abort it. It's just continued in manifesting its face in another way. And it is the outworking of a completely perverted worldview. And even this evolutionist here who wants evolutionary thinking, he wants selectionist thinking taught in medical schools, he said this, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, most applications were medical Darwinism that focused on the welfare of the species in connection with eugenics. This led to moral and social disaster. Well, is evolutionary thinking harmful? You better believe it is. It leads to moral and social disaster. And just like Darwin, when he looked at the peacock's feather, it suddenly made him sick. His thinking was so changed and it was so perverted. That's because the entire selectionist worldview, which he has fostered and foisted upon the minds of so much of Western civilization, is nothing but a complete death-driven world view. It has been and it always will be a death-driven worldview. Darwin ends his book with a picture, a mental picture like you see there up on the screen, where that lion is taking down that beast. And he says, from extinction of one creature after another, and from nature being red in tooth, comes that which is developed from it, which is the higher forms of animals. And in the very next sentence, he says, there is a grandeur in this view of life. Really? A grandeur in that view of life? No wonder looking at a peacock feather made him sick. His thinking was completely warped. And that's why even in 2009, on the 200th anniversary of Charles Darwin's birth, when evolutionists were celebrating all over the country, you had a birthday cake to Charles Darwin, and look what's in the center of the cake. It's a skull. I mean, when was the last time someone painted a skull on your birthday cake? You know, even when Granny's getting up there in years, you don't put a skull on her cake or anything like that. I mean, nobody does it. But that's because he has a death-driven worldview. And with his death-driven worldview, pictures like you see there on the upper left-hand side of the screen where you see one animal devouring another, it becomes normal in your thinking. It becomes normalized. You become numbed to it. But I can tell you one thing. The Bible says that that is a curse and that is an enemy. And I, for one, am waiting for the day when it is over once and for all. So, what can we learn from this? Well, belief in natural selection is what fueled eugenics. If you're out there saying evolution did it, you're wrong. Evolution, what's the link? But survival of the fittest, getting the fittest to breed and eliminating the unfit, that makes sense. Eugenics is how humans are trying to mimic natural selection, and natural selection isn't God's eugenics program. Some people have said that, you know, when eugenics was a way that God instituted after the fall to eliminate genetic defects from the population, so that when a child who is born with a genetic defect dies before reaching puberty, well, that's kind of a gift to the rest of us because they don't pass on those genes. Wrong. When a child dies early, it's not a gift, it's a tragedy. And it always will be a tragedy. And so evolutionary thinking, yeah, it causes a lot of blunders. It's due to this imagination, but it also harms us in many ways, and this is the book that covers it. And it points out that these fertile imagination is the integral part of selectionist thinking, and they believe what they really see in their minds. If you're interested in any other materials that talk about this, we have a chapter in this book on creation basics and beyond, probably the best all-around book for teaching about creation. I made sure we brought a couple of this DVD series. It's very devotional, very worshipful, made in His image, nothing death-driven in it all, describes both form and function and beauty in one thing that will hopefully lead you to that. We have a pushback against evolutionary thinking, Adam or Apes, are one of our latest DVDs. Some books, materials back there, our Acts and Facts magazine, which we want you to have for free just by signing up. Young people, not very many here tonight, please follow us on this. But you always keep in mind that the evolutionary thinking is not without consequence. It really bears harms to society. So thank you very much.
Well, Well, thank you, Dr. Guliuzza. I know it's late. We'll take one or two questions if anyone has one that's ready to go. Let's see. Dr. Brown.
So to what extent did situations like Ida and Archaeoraptor make it into the scientific literature?
Well, they actually made it into the scientific literature primarily on refutations on that. That's where you'll see where they were really in the scientific literature. And in fact, some of the criticisms for Archaeoraptor and Ida, but also for Artie, which did make it into the scientific literature, is that they really didn't go through a rigorous type of peer review, which should have weeded out them as unfit from getting into the scientific literature. But they really didn't. But well, you'll really find the discussion of them is on the rejection side.
Maybe one more question if we have one. I thought I saw a second hand. There we go.
Thanks. Just as far as the creation science movement in general and all the work that you and your coworkers are doing, are you seeing anything encouraging as far as what's happening in the church and what's happening with what you're doing in the work and as far as a movement, as something that God's doing? Are you encouraged? Are you hopeful for that?
Yes. I am very hopeful. In fact, I'll just keep it really quick. You know, when in the early days of the creation science movement, everybody was really, really hopeful because suddenly Henry M. Morris, who was the founder of ICR and also one of the founders of Creation Research Society as well. In fact, Creation Research Society predates ICR. I don't know if you knew that. It's just a few years older than ICR is the Creation Research Society. No, I know, you're not keeping count on there. And so suddenly there was answers to questions which people had been waiting for decades. And it launched the creation science movement, but in many ways, I think it actually was far more influential because pastors who at the time were being browbeaten because there was no answers to their questions, I really think in many ways led to a loss of biblical authority. But in the early 1960s, with that, there was a revival, not just in terms of creation science, but there was a revival within the church. And there was a revival in the church by putting the focus on a creator, and the creator by name was the Lord Jesus Christ. And I'm convinced, and I think I can document this, that a good portion of what was called the Jesus movement, of literally which millions of people were born again in the 1970s, of which I was one of them myself, was a direct result of this revival in faith and confidence in the Word of God. Then following that, which lasted for, you could easily say three and a half decades of time, there's become a complacency in the church. And it can lead you to be discouraged because many pastors will say, one, been there, done that, had these conferences, we don't need to have them anymore. Two, some pastors will say, that's now a controversial issue. And if I pick this up, then certain people in my church are just definitely going to leave the church on there. And so there was a day when all you had to do was whisper creation science event and thousands of people came, but now it doesn't have quite the draw. However, I am encouraged for two reasons. One, I think particularly in the realm of biology, our research and our explanations, and we're going to talk about this tomorrow morning sometime, is far better than it ever was in the early days. We have far better explanations. They're far more scientifically accurate. And we're actually on the verge of another revolution. Just like the Genesis flood was in geology, we're on the verge of another revolution in biology where we're able to see the engineering aspects. This isn't taking away from the beauty, but we're able to see the engineering aspects of what is actually happening in terms of growth, reproduction, particularly adaptation, and metabolism, particularly adaptation and metabolism, that we never had the tools to see before in the past. So we actually have the potential to have a better explanation, really where the rubber meets the road, which is creation, evolution, which is really biological evolution, that we can have answers to on that. Second, I'm encouraged because everywhere I go, usually at the end of my talks, there's always a cadre of somewhere between 5 to 15 young people. Not older people with gray hair like mine, but young people who come up and they're excited and they're enthusiastic and they have that zeal and that ardor of something which is really important to them. They sense it's important to them and they want to have a calling towards that. And so I'm always asking them, do you want to take my job someday? Would you like to take my job someday? And I never get this, nah, I don't want your job. I get, yeah, I want your job. On that, and there's this enthusiasm for young people to go on. So in terms of what we're doing in biological research, our geological research is better than ever as well, in my opinion, and the enthusiasm of young people, that's very encouraging.
Well, thank you again, Dr. Guliuzza.
Yeah, thank you.
And thank you all for sticking with us through this evening. I'll let you go. We're dismissed at this point. There's still some snacks out in the back if anyone needs something. And please do be back before 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. We'll begin promptly with our opening keynote. And with that, good night.